She knows more about this territory's land records than anyone in this room, including your solicitor. Jed Marlowe said it quietly, the way a man says something he has known for a while and has simply been waiting to say out loud. The fiddle player at the far end of the Millhaven Settlers Hall drew his bow across one last note and then stopped, as though the music itself wanted to hear what came next. Jed stood with one hand resting on the back of Thea Corbett's chair, looking steadily at Sterling Mace across the white-clothed length of the head table. Sterling had just asked, in the generous, carrying voice of a man who enjoys an audience, exactly how a cattle rancher from the Creek Flats had come to bring a telegraph girl to a gala hosted by the Millhaven Civic Association. The implication was not subtle, it was not meant to be. Jed did not flinch. She's the most honest person I've ever met, he said. In a room full of men who've built their fortunes on other people's paperwork, that counts for something. Nobody laughed, nobody moved their silverware, and the air in that hall, which had tasted of roast venison and imported Bordeaux all evening, suddenly tasted of something else entirely. That was the moment Thea Corbett understood that she had not been brought here to be a weapon. She had been brought here to be a witness. If this story moves you, subscribe to Fated Love and follow Thea and Jed's journey all the way through. Drop a comment and tell us what city you're watching from. We love knowing how far these stories travel. 3 days earlier, Jed Marlowe had received an envelope at his gatepost. It was sealed with the wax stamp of the Millhaven Civic Association and carried in careful cursive the words cordially requested. His neighbor Cyrus Webb had ridden over that same evening, helped himself to Jed's coffee, and read the invitation twice without being asked. You understand what this is, Cyrus said. A dinner. It's Sterling Mace in a good suit. Cyrus set the envelope on the kitchen table. He's been trying to buy your water rights for 3 years. Now he's inviting you to sit at his table, eat his food, and be surrounded by every man in this territory who owes him money. You know what that means. It means he wants to make the offer again, Jed said, in front of witnesses, so I look unreasonable when I say no. Or he's found a way to make you say yes without asking. Cyrus looked at him over the rim of his mug. Don't go. I'm going, Jed said, because I want to see his face when I say no again. Cyrus drank his coffee and said nothing more, which was his way of signaling that he had run out of arguments and not out of worry. What neither of them knew was that on that same afternoon, Georgina Mace had walked behind the Millhaven post office to where Thea Corbett took her afternoon break and made a proposition of her own. Thea had worked at the Millhaven telegraph office for 4 years. She was 28 years old, with calloused fingertips from the key and a memory sharp enough to recall any message she'd tapped out or transcribed, sometimes word for word. The work paid $4 a week, enough for her rented room above the feed merchants, enough for bread and oats and the occasional luxury of a newspaper. Not enough to forget why she was here. She had come to Millhaven in the spring of 1888, the same season her father, Victor Corbett, had lost their homestead on the Aspen Flats north of town. 42 acres of decent soil and reliable well water, held under a Dominion land grant since 1879. Victor had filed every renewal on time, paid every assessment without complaint, and then a regulatory amendment had changed the renewal deadline by 6 weeks without public posting, and when his renewal arrived at the land registry, it was 8 days late. The land had gone to auction that autumn. The sole bidder was a company called Mace Northern Holdings, incorporated in Winnipeg the previous spring. Thea had been 24. She had stood on the Aspen Flats the day the transfer took effect and made herself a quiet promise. She would learn every rule, every filing date, every statutory amendment, every deed transfer processed through the Northwest Territories land system. Not because she believed the rules would protect her. She had already learned they wouldn't. But because the only people who ever changed the rules were the people who understood them better than the ones who'd written them for their own benefit. The telegraph office was, it turned out, an extraordinary place to learn things. Every inquiry sent to the Dominion Land Office in Winnipeg passed through Thea's key. Every response came back through her hands. She began keeping a notebook, then a second, then a third, arranged in a canvas satchel under her bed, annotated in the small and careful script of a woman who could not afford to misplace anything. So when Georgina Mace appeared behind the post office in her dove-gray afternoon dress and offered Thea $8 to attend the Settlers Gala as Jed Marlowe's companion. Thea understood the geometry of the request before Georgina had finished explaining it. "We simply thought you deserved a seat at the table," Georgina said. "Someone with your background, your circumstances. These events ought to include everyone." "You want me to attend with Jed Marlowe," Thea said, "so the room looks at us together and draws its own conclusions." Georgina tilted her head. "I want you to enjoy a lovely evening." "You want me to embarrass him," Thea said. "I'd rather you just say that plainly." Something tightened in Georgina's expression, a small adjustment that a less attentive person might have missed. "We believe Mr. Marlowe could benefit from a broader social perspective. Naturally, you'd be provided with a suitable dress and a generous evening's compensation." $8, 2 full weeks of wages. Thea's back ached from 4 years of leaning over a telegraph key. Her boots had been resoled twice and were overdue for a third time. Her landlord had raised her rent in March. She said yes. She said yes the way a person says yes to something they know will cost them, with clear eyes and a stomach that knows better. She had not planned to say yes to this specific event, but she had been planning in one form or another since the autumn of 1888, and Georgina Mace had just handed her an invitation to walk into the right room, in front of the right people, with a reason to speak that nobody could dismiss as trespassing. The dress arrived Friday afternoon. It was green, a faded bottle green that had been beautiful once, perhaps on someone else in some other decade. The seams were tight across the shoulders. The hem dragged slightly at the back. Thea put it on alone in her room, looked at herself in the small mirror over the washstand, and thought about her father, about the way he'd pressed his hand against the Aspen Flats soil every spring before the planting, like he was checking a pulse. She thought about the canvas satchel under her bed, 4 notebooks, 2 years of copied telegraph records, a handwritten ledger of every Dominion land transfer that had crossed her desk since 1888, dates, deed numbers, registration codes, the names of every company and every filing agent connected to Mace Northern Holdings. She was not going to the gala to be embarrassed. She was going because the room would be full of the people who had let it happen, and she had waited 2 years for the right moment to be in the same room as all of them at once. The Millhaven Settlers Hall was the finest building in town, which in Millhaven of 1891 meant it had a second story, a covered entrance, and a chandelier shipped in from Calgary. Thea arrived at 7:30 and stood near the entrance, holding her own wrap because Georgina had not thought to provide one, and watched the room through the doorway before going in. The hall was full. The Millhaven Civic Association turned out its membership every year for the Settlers Gala. The land agents, the bank manager, the magistrate, the sawmill operator, the men who held the territory's commerce in their hands and called it community. The women beside them wore silk and spoke in careful, carrying tones. Thea wore bottle green and stood very still. She did not see Jed Marlowe until he had already seen her. He came from across the room with a directness that did not look like hurry, but covered the distance quickly. He was taller than she remembered from the few times she'd sent wires on his behalf, lean and weather-worn, wearing a dark wool jacket that had been well kept without being fashionable. He looked like a man who had put on his one good coat for his father's funeral and had not found another occasion worthy of it since. He stopped in front of her. She looked up at him, expecting the usual calculation, the quick assessment of what she cost him, the decision whether to cut his losses and walk past. People generally made that calculation quickly when they looked at her. He did not make it. "Miss Corbett," Jed said, "I believe I've been hoping to speak with you." Thea blinked. "You haven't been told anything?" "I haven't been told anything useful in 3 years." He said it without particular bitterness. "But I'd consider it a privilege if you'd join me this evening." Something moved across her face that was not quite hope. She had been careful with hope for a long time, but that recognized with a startled precision that the world was doing something it was not supposed to do. She had prepared for many possibilities in the past 3 days. She had not prepared for this. "You know what this is," she said quietly. "I know exactly what it is," Jed said. He offered his arm. "And I know it isn't going to go the way they planned." She took his arm. The room noticed, not with any dramatic signal, but in the way rooms notice things, conversations pausing mid-sentence, heads turning with the practiced casualness of people who want to observe without appearing to. Thea felt the weight of it. She had felt heavier weights. Jed walked her to the head table, the seat directly beside Georgina Mace. He pulled out the chair for her and seated himself to her right, and Georgina held her composure by the particular effort of a woman who had trained herself to hold it, though Thea saw the half-second of alarm before the smile reset. "How lovely," Georgina said. "You've brought your guest." "I've brought Miss Corbett," Jed said. "I'd be grateful if she were introduced accordingly." Sterling Mace, at the head of the table, said nothing. He was a substantial man, broad-shouldered and prosperous, with the kind of face that had learned to look magnanimous without the inconvenience of actually being so. He watched Jed settle in and recalculated something behind his eyes. Thea pressed her hands flat against her thighs beneath the table and breathed carefully. She had not come to shake. She was not going to shake. Dinner began. 3 courses of food that most of Millhaven never tasted. Thea ate with deliberate attention to the silverware arrangements, mirroring without mimicking, watching everything. Between courses, Jed turned to her. "What do you do?" he asked. Not what do you do for a living. He already knew that. He asked it, the way she had once heard a schoolteacher ask it. "What do you actually do?" "I read telegraph records," Thea said. "Land filings, deed transfers, anything that comes through the office. In the evenings, I copy the ones that seem important." Jed set down his fork. "How many evenings?" "Most of them, for 2 years." "Why?" She looked at him. "Because my father's homestead was taken through a filing amendment that was never publicly posted, and the buyer was registered through a shell company in Winnipeg 3 months before the amendment was processed." She kept her voice level. "I decided I'd learn the system well enough to explain it to someone who could do something about it." Jed was quiet for a moment. "The Aspen Flats homestead," he said. "That was your family." "That was my father, Victor Corbett. He died the following winter. He couldn't afford a physician." She did not soften the sentence. She had stopped softening it a long time ago. It was a fact, and facts were what she had. Jed held her gaze, and she saw in his face the thing she had learned to watch for, not pity, which she would have recognized and closed herself against, but recognition. The particular expression of someone who has been carrying the same kind of knowledge alone, and is surprised to find someone else who speaks the language. "Tell me what you found," he said. She did. For the duration of the second course, Thea explained, in precise and measured terms, the mechanism by which Sterling Mace had acquired 11 properties in the Northwest Territory over 7 years. The Dominion Land Act Amendment, the unposted filing changes, the Winnipeg registration of Mace Northern Holdings, the pattern, regulatory shift, default, auction, sole bidder. At the far end of the table, Magistrate Henry Tapp leaned toward the sawmill operator beside him and muttered something. The sawmill operator shook his head. They were watching Thea and Jed. They looked like men who had expected to watch a comedy and were no longer certain of the genre. The first direct attack came from Lorelei Farrow, wife of the largest landowner in the East Valley, who had the particular gift of weaponizing pleasantry. She leaned across the table toward Thea with a warm and terrible smile. "I believe I recognize that dress," Lorelei said, pitched to Carrie. "I donated a bundle to the church clothing drive last autumn. Isn't that? I think that's the green one from my closet." The table rippled with suppressed amusement. Thea did not drop her eyes. Jed turned to Lorelei with an expression of polite interest. "Mrs. Farrow, that's generous of you, the donation. I've always thought that generosity and discretion belong together, though. When they get separated, one of them makes the other look small." The amusement at the table stopped. Lorelei's husband stared at his plate. 20 minutes later, Magistrate Tapp, emboldened by brandy and the sound of his own voice, addressed Thea directly. "Miss Corbett, was it? I imagine an evening like this must be somewhat out of your usual territory." He smiled the smile of a man who has never had to calculate where he belonged in a room. "What on earth does a telegraph operator find to talk about at a dinner like this?" Thea met his eyes without hesitation. "Land law," she said. Tapp laughed, a short sound, the kind that comes from discomfort, pretending to be amusement. "She knows more about this territory's filing procedures than you do, Henry," Jed said quietly. "And probably more than your clerk. She's been documenting land registry amendments since 1888. Everyone that came through the Millhaven telegraph office. I'd be careful about dismissing what you haven't read." Tapp opened his mouth and closed it. He had the look of a man who had been navigating by familiar landmarks and had just been told that several of them were painted backdrops. Something had shifted. Thea felt it, the way a barometer changes before weather arrives. The plan they had built for this evening was coming apart at its seams, and Sterling Mace, who had not spoken much since the opening exchange, was watching it happen with the patience of a man recalculating his next move. He waited until the third course. Mace was always patient. He had not built what he'd built by rushing. He set down his wine glass with deliberate unhaste and turned his attention, with the practiced warmth of a man who has never not been the most powerful person in the room, toward Thea. "Miss Corbett." He said her name the way you identify a property by its lot number. "I understand your father held land up on the Aspen Flats. Victor Corbett, wasn't it? Before circumstances changed." The table went quiet. Thea felt it, the particular quality of a silence built to witness something. Everyone at that table knew what Mace was doing, and most of them were going to let him do it. "Yes," she said. "A difficult business, losing a homestead." Mace shook his head with performed sympathy. "I always thought it was the saddest thing, when a man couldn't keep pace with the administrative requirements. Did he ever understand, do you think, where things went wrong?" Every eye in the room settled on Thea. She could feel the weight of them, pressing down, waiting. Her hands were flat against the tablecloth, completely still. She looked at Sterling Mace. "My father understood exactly what went wrong," she said. Her voice was even, level as surveyed ground. "He lost his land because the annual renewal deadline was moved forward by 6 weeks under a regulatory amendment issued in March of 1888. The amendment was never posted at the Millhaven Land Office. The only filing agents who knew about it in advance were those who had received prior notice through a private communication." She paused. "That communication was sent by telegraph. I have a copy of the transmission record in my room." Silence. The purchasing entity that acquired the Aspen Flats property at the subsequent auction was Mace Northern Holdings, incorporated in Winnipeg in January of 1888. Thea's voice did not change pitch or speed. 2 months before the regulatory amendment was submitted to the Dominion Land Office. 4 months before the deadline change took effect. The same company has since acquired 10 other properties in this territory using the identical sequence of events. Nobody moved. Mace's wineglass was still in his hand. His face had not changed, not one muscle, but something behind it had, the way a door changes when it locks from the inside. "That's a very serious claim to make in public," Mace said. His voice was silk, cold silk. "I'd encourage you to consider the difference between the records of a small telegraph office and an actual legal proceeding." "I'm not making a legal argument," Thea said. "I'm answering your question. You asked whether my father understood what went wrong." She looked at him with clear, flat eyes that held no hatred and no performance, only the particular clarity of someone who has been waiting for this exact moment and is finally standing beside it. "He told me the last winter we had together that the people who write the rules always leave a door open for themselves. He told me to find the door." Jed's hand moved. Not toward her, he did not presume that. He placed his open palm on the table between them. "An offering, a bridge. Take it or don't, your choice." Thea did not take his hand. She did not need to yet. But she saw it, and something in her chest that had been load-bearing for a very long time shifted its weight, slightly, toward something else. What happened next did not happen dramatically. It did not happen with raised voices or overturned glasses. It happened the way things fall apart in rooms like that one, through a single person who can no longer justify their silence. Her name was Opal Prentice. She ran the Millhaven General Store and had done business in this territory for 19 years. She had attended every Settlers Gala. She had watched Victor Corbett's homestead go to auction. She had heard the regulatory amendment discussed among the land agents over coffee in her store the week before it was issued. Because men who assume the woman behind the counter is too occupied to listen have always been mistaken about that. Opal stood up from her chair at the middle table. "Sterling," she said. "I was in my store when Abe Fincher and Roy Gleed discussed the deadline change. I heard them say certain parties had been given advance notice and others hadn't. Victor Corbett came to me the following spring and asked if I'd heard anything about the filing dates changing. Her voice, steady until then, cracked slightly at the center. I told him I hadn't. That was a lie, and I've been carrying it for 3 years. The hall was absolutely still. Thea could hear the candles. "I'm sorry," Opal said. She looked directly at Thea. "I'm sorry I didn't say something when it would have mattered." Thea had cried out all the tears she had over this. There were none left, but she felt the shape of them, the ghost of grief that never fully leaves, and she nodded once, slowly. "Thank you," Thea said, and she meant it without reservation. Not because Opal's words fixed anything, they didn't. You cannot rebuild a homestead with words. But she had said it in front of Sterling Mace, in front of the magistrate, in front of everyone who had let it happen. That took something Thea had not expected to find in this room. Courage. Jed stood. Not because Thea needed him to. She had made that abundantly clear. He stood because some moments require you to be on your feet, counted present, to let the room understand that you are not a bystander and never were. "I think the evening is finished," Jed said. "This is my hall," Sterling Mace said. His composure was rebuilding itself with the effort of a man who had survived setbacks before. "The evening ends when I say it does." "Your hall," Jed agreed. "Your town, your rules, your land office, your magistrate. You've built something thorough, Sterling. I'll say that for you." He looked around the room. "But you left one piece out of your calculations." "And what's that?" "You never counted on someone reading everything." He offered Thea nothing more elaborate than the crook of his arm. She rose, took it, and walked toward the door. Opal Prentice walked out behind her, the sawmill operator's wife, whose brother had lost property on the East Creek 2 years prior, stood and followed, then a homesteader from the back of the hall, then another couple near the windows. Not everyone stood. It was not a revolution. It was enough people, though, that Sterling Mace, left at the head of his own table, could hear the chairs scraping against the floor like a language he had not expected to need to translate. The 10 days that followed were not easy. Mace moved quickly. He had the territory's land agent send Jed a formal compliance notice, a technical challenge to the water license for Clearwater Creek, citing an irregularity that had not existed until 2 days prior. He had Thea's employment reviewed, on the grounds that telegraph operators were not permitted to engage in private transcription of official communications. Jed filed a counter-challenge the same afternoon, citing the reciprocity clause in the Northwest Territories Act that entitled any license holder subject to a compliance review to request a concurrent audit of the reviewing office's own filing history. It was Thea who had told him about that clause, 3 weeks before the gala, over the kitchen table at his ranch, where she had spread 2 years of copied records across the surface and walked him through exactly how the machinery worked. They had been preparing, in a sense, since the night of the gala, and in another sense, since the day Thea had made herself a promise over 42 acres of stolen soil. Thea's employment was reinstated after Opal Prentice and 4 other Millhaven residents submitted a written account of her irreproachable professional conduct to the territory's telegraph commissioner. Opal organized the letters herself. She did it with the calm efficiency of a woman who had been running a business for 19 years and had simply needed a reason to direct her energy somewhere it would matter. The Dominion Land Inspector, assigned to the Western Territory Circuit, a quiet and thorough man named Magnuson, arrived in Millhaven on a Tuesday morning. He met with Thea for 2 hours in the back room of the land office, reviewed her notebooks, compared her copied records against the originals, and said very little. When he stood to leave, he paused at the door. "Miss Corbett," he said, "in 9 years of reviewing land offices across this territory, I have never seen documentation of this quality from a private individual." "I had access and motive," Thea said. "That's a useful combination." "You had more than that," Magnuson said. "You had patience." The investigation took 4 months. Magistrate Tapp resigned before it concluded. The land agent who had processed the Aspen Flats transfer cooperated in exchange for reduced penalties. Sterling Mace hired lawyers from Winnipeg. They were good lawyers. It did not help. The evidence was complete. The pattern was documented. 11 properties, 11 families. The findings went to the Dominion Land Commissioner in Ottawa with a recommendation that all transfers conducted through Mace Northern Holdings under the fraudulent amendment be reviewed for reversal. The Aspen Flats homestead was returned to the Corbett estate, which, in practice, meant it was returned to Thea. She went there on a morning in late September, when the aspens were already yellow at their edges, and the air had the particular quality of Canadian autumn, cool and honest, and carrying the smell of things releasing themselves without grief. Jed drove her in his wagon, and neither of them spoke for the first 20 minutes of the ride, which was companionable rather than awkward. The silence of two people who have said enough of the necessary things and can afford to be quiet. She stepped down at the property line. The land was rough with 2 years of neglect, the kitchen garden overgrown, the fence posts leaning, the well cover half off its hinge. The house was still standing. Thea walked to the center of the property and knelt down. She pressed her palm flat against the soil. It was the same gesture her father had made every spring, checking a pulse. The land was still alive. She did not cry. She had been dry of tears for a long time, and the feeling that came was different from grief, wider, slower, like water finding its level after running constrained for years. "Pass," she said very quietly. "I found the door." Jed waited by the wagon. He was the kind of man who understood when something belonged only to the person living it. He had learned, in the months since the gala, that Thea Corbett was a person who needed room, not distance, but room. The way some trees grow better when they are not crowded. When she walked back, her eyes were dry and her back was straight, and she looked exactly like what she was. A woman who had spent 3 years building a case and won it. "I'm going to rebuild it," she told him, "and I want to file a land agency application. There's a clause in the Dominion Act that allows for territorial land agents. I've read the requirements. I'm qualified." She looked at him steadily. "I want to help people understand their filings. The families who are still in the middle of losing things may set in motion before we stopped him." "You'll need an office," Jed said. "I'll need a lot of things. There's a room at the back of the station house that faces the creek. Good light. It's yours if you want it." Thea studied him the way she studied a document, carefully, looking for what was and wasn't there, for the small evidence of whether the structure held. "I'm not looking for charity," she said. "I know," Jed said. "I'm looking for a partner, someone who won't look away." She was quiet for a moment. Around them, the aspens moved in the cool September air, dropping their leaves with the particular ease of something that has been through this many times and trusts the season. "I haven't looked away since the gala," Jed continued, "and I don't plan to start." She reached out and took his hand, not the way she had declined it at dinner. This was different. This was not a bridge offered uncertainly. This was a decision made in full, with clear eyes, by a woman who had learned that some things are worth the risk of wanting. "Then you've got one," she said. Sterling Mace was convicted on 8 counts of fraudulent filing and 2 counts of conspiracy to obstruct Dominion land proceedings. His properties were seized under territorial order. The 11 stolen homesteads were returned to their original holders, or to their families where the original holders had not survived to see it. Opal Prentice served on the committee that oversaw the land restoration process and never charged a fee for her time. She said it was the least she could do, and she meant it without ceremony. Cyrus Webb threw a small celebration at his property and burned 3 years' worth of land pressure correspondence in his fire pit, which he found deeply satisfying. Jed Marlowe kept his water rights, his cattle, and his fence lines, straight as they had always been, which was very straight because he was a careful man. He added 1 room to the station house at the back, with east-facing windows, a good lamp, and a wide desk. Thea Corbett became the first licensed woman land agent in the Northwest Territories. She handled her first case the following spring. A Métis family whose scrip had been improperly registered and who had spent 2 years trying to speak to someone with the authority to listen. She charged them nothing. She won. She and Jed were married the summer after, in the yard of the Aspen Flats property, which by then had new fence posts and a repaired well and a kitchen garden she had planted from seed that spring. The ceremony was attended by Opal Prentice, Cyrus Webb, Inspector Magnuson, who made the trip from Winnipeg, and a generous portion of the territory's settler community, including several families whose filings Thea had helped secure in the months between the investigation's close and the wedding morning. It was a short ceremony. Thea had not planned a long one. She had never much believed in long declarations. She believed in records, in the quiet, patient accumulation of evidence that the thing being claimed was real and would hold. She had enough of that evidence now. She had the land under her feet and the man beside her, and 30 years of work ahead of her, and the certain knowledge that her father, who had once pressed his hand to this soil and felt a pulse, had been right about the one thing that mattered most. If you learned the rules, all of them, every clause, every amendment, every buried footnote in the statute books, you did not merely survive the system. You changed it.